Hey everyone, welcome back to Comps 301. I wanted to quickly talk to you about chapter 10.1 and really cover the organizational pattern that you're going to be using for your introduction speech. I know the textbook covers it in detail, but I did want to just provide you a different example and just kind of run really quickly some main points of topical pattern. So let's get right into topical pattern. All right, so when you use a topical pattern, you are breaking a large idea or category into smaller ideas or subcategories. In short, you're finding logical divisions to a whole. And this is really important to understand because sometimes topicals, I get a lot of different ideas that aren't connected to a bigger picture. So we want to make sure that we understand that concept. We want to understand what is the picture, defining that bigger picture of what is that bigger picture, what is that main idea, and then how do we then create smaller ideas and or subcategories. So that's going to be the very first thing that you need to really figure out for this speech is what is that larger idea that you want to share for the class so that then you can begin to structure into smaller ideas or subcategories. There has to be a bigger idea that connects those smaller categories to one idea. So the topical pattern breaks a topic down into these logical divisions, but does not necessarily offer any guidance in how we order them. So once we have that big idea and we break it down into those small categories, then we can talk about those categories in any number of ways that we can consider. So, if we are thinking of chronological pattern, which is discussed in this section and in this chapter, we think of chronological, it has to be ordered chronologically, right? So we have to put, if we're talking about time, if you're going to talk 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, we would organize them 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Or if we're doing counting backwards, 50s, 40s, 30s, 20s, etc. Right? So there's a specific pattern of organization. And each of those organizational patterns, like chronological, like spatial, offers you a guidance. But when it comes to topical, there's no real clear guidance of, hey, I made this main idea, I've divided into these smaller categories, but there's no real guidance on what of which of these smaller topics you or smaller ideas you're going to talk about first, second, or third. So, what that looks like essentially, and I'm giving you this example because I feel like once we can visualize what topical is, it's easier for us to start crafting and organizing our body. So, in a speech about Woodstock music, art, and fair, for example, you could break the main points down to one. So, the main idea, the Woodstock music and art fair. But now we've broken it into smaller categories. The first category, the musicians who performed. The second category, the musicians who declined to perform. And third, the audience. And all of these fall into that one umbrella. So, really, really, really think of that bigger umbrella before you start breaking into smaller categories because it's going to be easier for you to then break it down. So, uh, we can talk about this in a number of ways, and we go back to this notion of there's no guidance in ordering them. So, if you talked about the audience first, great. Like it might make sense, especially if the audience is a big part of the Woodstock Music and Art Fair, then the musicians who declined to perform and the musicians who actually performed. So it might make sense that way. Or it might make sense to talk about the musicians who performed first, then the musicians who declined, and lastly, the audience. So there's no clear direction in topical organization of which goes first and second. You could also break it down into three specific performances. So we're still talking Woodstock Music and Art Fair as the umbrella, but now here's a different way to a different set of categories that we can break the music an art fair, Woodstock Music and Art Fair, which include the three specific performances: Santana, the Grateful Dead, and Creedence Clearwater Revival. You can also break down Woodstock Music and Art Fair by the three genres of music that are played. And so we have folk, funk, and rock, right? So Topical allows us the ability to really figure out how we want to create these categories, but don't be confused when it comes to Topical as a free for all. It's not a free for all. You still have to find that big umbrella, and then you have to section those categories. And so, one of the things also with Topical is that, and with any organizational pattern, is that we want to maintain ideas to the body or to the main points that they belong to. So, if you're going to talk about rock in our last genre, uh, subcategories, which are folk, funk, rock. If you're going to talk about rock, you want to stick to talking about rock, right? We want to make sure that we are clearly organized, and in the section about folk, we're talking about in the section about folk. In the section about funk, we're talking about funk. When we get to our third main point, which is rock, we talk about rock. And that'll make it really easy for your audience to follow along and not be like, why are they talking about folk now? Didn't we just talk about that in your third main point? So we want to make sure we are still staying in those lanes. So once you figure out those three categories that you're going to talk about within your main idea, you stay within those categories. All right, I hope that was helpful and that this example is a little bit allows you to see how one umbrella can be broken down into several different categories. And that is essentially what topical arrangement is that we have just one main idea and then we're focusing on these separate smaller ideas and then we're chunking them together. All right. And lastly, I did want to quickly talk about that speaking note card from chapter 12, 12.2. So I want to make sure that we understand what is expected of us for the introduction speech. So for the introduction speech, there are, I am not expecting you or you are not allowed to create a full sentence outline or write out your entire presentation because this class is really to teach you how to develop conversation like presentation, extemporaneous deliveries. And so, starting off the semester with working on speaking note cards is going to really help you differentiate between just writing it all out, memorizing it, or reading it to us. We want to learn how to use note cards and engage in that conversation like a delivery. So for the speaking note cards, and this is pulled directly from your textbook, so none of this should be new to you. But from the speaking note cards, it says keywords and phrases, but in some instances, we have extended quotations that need to be fully written. And what I mean by that is if you have quotations, which you shouldn't in your introduction speech, other than if you are putting in a quote, like a memorable quote to begin or to end, but you shouldn't have any research, right? So there shouldn't be any quotes. But for your other presentations, if you are quoting someone, you want to make sure that if you are directly quoting them, you are saying exactly what that quote says. So we aren't flagged for plagiarism. So some instances, we're going to have those direct quotes, but for the most part, it's keywords and phrases. So your speech has to have five components, which are the introduction, main point one, main point two, main point three, and the conclusion. So five components. So hidden gem number five is that, or number six, hidden gem number six for week 2 module is that your speech has five components and therefore you should only create and have five note cards for your presentation. And on each note card, and so that was the end of the hidden gem. So hidden gem, your speech has five components and therefore you're allowed five note cards. But now those note cards, one is for the introduction, one is for the main point one, main point two, main point three, and the conclusion. So very simple keywords and phrases. So nothing fully written out unless it's a direct quote. And this is just to help guide you during your presentation, but they're not crutches. You're not going to lean on them for the entire presentation. They're just there to aid you. Yes? All right. So, once again, for this assignment, introduction speech, you are to not write a full speaking outline or a manuscript of a speech, but instead you are to create speaking note cards. All right, well, this is it for my quick mini chapter 10.2 and chapter 12.2 lesson. If you do have any questions and need some clarification, please schedule some time to meet. I know I don't have set office hours, but I am available to meet with you on Zoom or just answer a quick message. All right, that's it. Have a great